What time is it?
No, April. That's crazy. Yeah. Hold the crowd back. Planning on attending or?
I thought he was, but everything's dark downstairs. Up here, but I guess I was wrong.
Okay, well, I'll tell you, we're gonna wait a couple minutes because I thought that he was interested in coming, so.
Yeah.
Gabby, you know, anybody else mentioned coming to the meeting?
No.
No, okay. All right, we'll need a minute or two here. City Council Finance Committee meeting is now in session. Today's date, Monday, April the 11th, 2021. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Tonight, we have the members of the Finance Committee, which is Councilman Bruce Havens, Councilman Dennis Brewster, and Chairman Martin DeVries, as well as Auditor April Wilkins, and President of Council Jason Jacobs, and Council Clerk Kajabi Gal. Tonight, we're here to discuss an ordinance, which is T53. This is an ordinance that I've been discussing for a while, in order to make us a little more efficient during our meetings and maybe kind of update what we have in our ordinance as far as the dollar amounts so that we're not constantly legislating over then and now. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our auditor and have her explain some of the changes that have been made and what the purposes of this legislation is.
Thank you, Mr. DeVries. So the purpose of the legislation and the way we've structured it is to basically increase the limitation that is in the threshold that is in Ohio Revised Code. So currently in Ohio Revised Code, the fiscal officer is required to get council's approval prior to authorizing, executing the then and now certificate for any then and now that is $3,000 or more. So what this legislation would do would take that threshold up to $50,000. And then we would come and ask for council approval for anything $50,000 or greater. Now, I went back and I looked all the way back to 2020 and just individual certificates. In 2020, we've had 13 so far. And in 2021, we had 35. Now that's individual certificates, not pieces of legislation. Back in 2020, we changed the way we structured our ordinance in that we no longer do one piece of legislation for each certificate. We have an exhibit in the back that we add all the then and now certificates to cover that period in that exhibit. So that was one first step to try and reduce the amount of legislation that comes before council. And of course, there's an immediate need to pass that right away, because in many cases, when you have a then and now, the invoice is already due. The way you get into a then and now scenario is some type of good or service has already been procured before they've gotten authorization to actually do the procurement. Now, that sounds bad, but in some cases, these are multi-year agreements that cover multiple fiscal years. We only allow an encumbrance of the current year's appropriation. So sometimes things slip through the cracks, and you'll see an invoice come through for the second year of your agreement. And of course, you're now in a then and now situation because you're getting your purchase order signed after that invoice date. So in most cases, it's those types of situations, or an emergency, such as our camera van has broken, or a lift broke at the service garage, something emergency in nature, but of course, they need to go and solicit services in order to make a repair. And sometimes they just don't have time to get that physical document in first. So from what I've seen in my 5 years here, it's typical situations like that. Lorraine County has sent us an invoice to participate in their hazmat program or something like that. It's not been anything egregious. It's not been intentional in nature. It's typically an oversight, just something that happens routinely, and something just gets missed in the shuffle. I also went back and looked to see what our highest amount of a certification has been, with the exception of one, which was around 200,000, and that was the payment of our insurance. Again, it's a contract, but what happened in that scenario was the treasurer's office received the bill, and they give it to him up front, well before the invoice is due. Well, that invoice though has a date, and he gets it in advance, and then he creates his purchase order based on that, because those amounts fluctuate once we do an evaluation of our assets. So with exception to that one instance, I'm showing the largest then and now has been around $27,000, and that was actually this year. And again, it was a payment, I believe, to CarryWorks, which is a software vendor, and it was a renewal. So I believe wholeheartedly that it's going to be unlikely that we will reach or exceed a $50,000 threshold. And the reason for that is because there's so many rules around the $50,000 mark, in that any purchase or of goods or service $50,000 or more, that's automatically prompted by some legislation that comes to council for approval. I've not seen a department supersede or do anything without having council's approval in those situations. So I do believe that would be extremely rare in nature that it would ever be greater than 50. Also, I wanted to point out that there's several steps that come into play before we get to purchasing. And as we know, we go through the appropriation process. We go through asking council for approval to allow the mayor to enter into a contract or to bid a specific item. In situations where it's bid, then You come back, you have another piece of legislation that authorizes him to enter into a contract. So there's a lot of steps in the process of procuring anything. That this should be very rare and unique in nature anyway, right? So I guess that sums it up for me. That's unless you have questions, but those are my thoughts on the then and now. The only other thing I would mention is I have spoken to local government services, which is a division of the auditor of state in regards to this issue. We had a lot of conversation back in 2020 in light of this because there seemed to be some differing of opinion. But putting together the legislation, which has been before council one other time, that was not only a suggestion from LGS, but it was also a suggestion from our auditors at the time. The then and now certification is not meant to make our jobs more difficult. It's not meant to put an extra step before paying your vendors. Of course, our number one priority is to make sure we are in good standing with our vendors. We're able to continue city services. We're able to procure the things that we need in a reasonable amount of time to make sure we're meeting the needs of our community. So this is not meant to make things difficult. It's really a safeguard to ensure that there's no misspending, that council is aware, the legislative body is aware of where money is going and has authorized the use of those monies. So that's why I mentioned kind of the steps that get us to that point, because in my mind, this is just one level of safeguard. So that's why I put a threshold in there. I think putting the threshold in helps still with a safeguard, using the same limitation of other legislation that's required to come before council, but also gives us a little bit more flexibility in just ensuring that our bills are being paid on time and that we're meeting our financial obligations.
Very good, thank you. Appreciate it. I know you put a lot of work into this. We've talked about it a number of times in the past, and I appreciate the work done on this. I have had two other council people call me individually and express their concerns about the dollar amount. 50,000 seemed exceedingly high. In light of that, we had pulled some information from local communities to see what their ordinances look like, as well as the times we've used that and now in the last couple of years. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if you've seen this research from
I did.
Javi, but like if we would have had last year, our ordinance was set at 15,000, we would have only had to vote basically one time on a then and now legislation. So I guess my point being, and this is not a personal thing, we always look at the position and we trust you, you've done an outstanding job. But I think about down the road, like what could potentially happen if we give somebody this much freedom, $50,000. So I guess my question would be a lesser amount. Let's say, for instance, if it was $20,000. Do you think that it's still something conducive to what we're trying to achieve here?
I do. It really just depends on how comfortable council is. If there's members that would prefer it to be lower and that brings them greater comfort, I don't see an issue with that. I guess there are very few that reach that amount. It just depends on how council views the threshold and how comfortable they are if we do start to see then and now certifications necessary for expenditures greater than that amount. Will we be in the same scenario again in trying to raise the threshold to mitigate, excess legislation? I think we see a then and now, legislation nearly every meeting. And you're not even seeing all of them. You see those that are $3,000 or more. So I guess I would ask that they consider how often they would like to see this type of legislation. And if if they're comfortable continuing to adopt and pass with the emergency clause at those meetings.
Thank you. Other members of the committee, do you have any questions or comments you'd like to make?
Comment that I would like to make is by giving $50,000, as you pointed out, contracts, that allows for some contracts to be automatically, just about automatically renewed, when actually they should be reviewed. And I can think of one right now that should be reviewed, and that's the agreement we have with Norfolk Southern for silent horns. And if we put the threshold too high, we won't get that chance to review it. And I'm sure in the past, there's other contracts that have been out there that we should have reviewed because they had outlived their usefulness. So I have to admit, I'm uncomfortable with the 50,000. And speaking from personal experience with another city, very large, I was a recipient of the $25,000 threshold. And quite frankly, the gentleman who ordered the product from me, he had to look at the system to make sure he kept everything under the $25,000. And which, if I was a councilman, it was something that should have been reviewed by council, but I was not a councilman, I was a salesman. And so that's what I think 50,000 is just a bit too much.
Thank you, Mr. Havens.
If I could respond, I definitely understand your concern in wanting to review ongoing contracts or items such as that to avoid any type of maneuvering, I'll call it. But let's not confuse the two things. If we get an invoice from Norfolk, well, one, if the contract to Norfolk is, I believe, $10,000 a year, that would never come before council for review because your threshold is $50,000. The only time this comes before council is if they bill us before the department has put in the purchase order. So in cases like that, those would not come to council for review. The threshold for a contract to come before council for review is $50,000. So any contracts made that don't include the trade-in of equipment would not come before council unless they were $50,000 or more. So those are two different scenarios in that this certification just provides the authorization to pay the bill. That's all it does. It's basically saying that at the time the contract was made, there were appropriations set aside for this specific purpose, and that I have authorization to pay it. That's all the certification does. There's 3 different types of certifications by Ohio Revised Code, and that's a standard purchase order, which says it gives the fiscal officer authorization to sign a purchase order as long as the funding has been within the fund has been appropriated lawfully and is in treasury or on its way to treasury. Then there's a blanket and a super blanket authorization. And the difference between those two is that a blanket or a super blanket authorization is just saying it's specific to a line, like an account, versus the fund in itself. And then there is the then and now certification, which says nearly the same thing. The funds have to be appropriated, they have to be in treasury or on their way to treasury, but that at the time in which the contract was entered into, the purchase order was just not in place at that time. So let's not get confused with the process for procurement from paying the invoice itself and approving the purchase order.
Yeah, I'm in favor of whatever amount council decides to have on this. It's as you stated, the money's already been appropriated. Council's already looked at it, during appropriations, been aware of it. It's a procedural issue. In that the invoice or the, purchase order hasn't been done prior to they being asked to be paid. So I'm all for trying to make things more efficient in your department. You said something earlier that really is something that we have to be concerned about, is we have to make sure we have good communication and treat our vendors well. They provided a service and they're waiting to get paid. And they're waiting for council to meet the next meeting. So I'm sure there's times when they're waiting up to 2 weeks to get paid when maybe they shouldn't have to, again, because the money's already appropriated. It's there, they're just waiting for a procedural issue. So I'm very much in favor of moving this forward at whatever amount the rest of council decides is appropriate.
I just want to add, we wrote the legislation with the threshold of 50,000. Because in the last legislation that we put before council, there was not a threshold. It was blanket, any amount. So the reason why we did that was because we felt maybe if there was a threshold, that would bring some comfort. But whatever council deems appropriate, I'm 100% fine with. We'll continue to do things in whatever manner council sees fit.
And I don't have an issue with the 20,000 you suggested earlier. That would take care of historically 90% of the items that come across your desk that have to go before council. So, if that makes people more comfortable, I would certainly be in favor of that.
I agree. I don't want to get rid of them now altogether, because there's times where there's a purpose for it, but if, like Councilman Booth just mentioned, if we can get rid of 90% of that, I think, again, it makes us more efficient. And the perception of the people that we continue to do this through emergency, it's not a good one. And it's something that we can actually, if managed correctly, can make sure that they understand appropriate for it. It's so we're aware of it. It's just a matter of procedure. So, Mr. President, do you have any comments?
I think you guys have all hit the nail on the head with all the comments so far, and I'm in agreement that first and foremost the intention behind it, I think, is spot on, to try to make the meetings more efficient. Limit emergency clauses, I think, is always good, but at the same time, having to keep the vendors happy is obviously a concern as well. I think that I do agree that going from 3,000 all the way up to 50,000 does seem like a bit of a jump. And as Mr. Booth just pointed out, bringing that down to a level of around 20,000 would still, take care of the vast majority. I mean, last year we would have had one, as opposed to however many we ended up actually having for 2021. So I think it makes sense, but the lower amount of 20,000 might be maybe an easier pill to swallow for some of the council people as well.
Thank you. Mr. Avens, what is your comfort level with the 20,000 number?
20,000 would be fine. Yeah, I just feel comfortable with 50,000. Not so much I'm worried about present administration, I'm more worried about future administrations. So, yeah.
Ms. Auditor, any final comments? Okay. Any other final comments from anybody else? Okay, with that said, I guess we will I'll make a motion to forward this to council, an amended version of T53 amended, obviously for the dollar amount of $3,000 up to $20,000. So it was moved by DeVries, seconded by Booth to amend T53 to $20,000 and forward to council for their approval. All in favor, say yes. Yes. Opposed? Very good. Thank you everyone for being here. Appreciate it. And this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.